The Pacific Theater, the second major war zone for the Second World War. The war zone in the theater from 1941 to 1945. This is a very large topic that has 15 main events we're going to be looking at when it comes to the war in the Pacific and how it relates to the Cultural Revolution in China afterwards. You definitely would want to take a few breaks along the way, as there is quite a bit of work we can cover, both before the war in the Pacific began, during, and after. So let's get started. In World War II, there essentially was two major theaters of war. The European, which was under German control, the Nazis, and the Asia theater control, which was under the Japanese. For this case, we're going to be focusing on the Pacific Theater, the second theater of the Second World War, and the major epicenter or geographical area where the conflict and a substantial amount of fighting took place. This is what we mean by the theater. Now, the first event happened from 1931 to 1937, and in the first event, it was when Imperial Japan, a member of the Axis powers, invaded Manchuria in 1931, and then China eventually in 1937. Manchuria, also known as Manchukuo, was rich in natural resources that Imperial Japan needed for their expanding empire and the prosperity Asia sphere that they were promoting. This was the expansion of the Japanese Empire. Japan had felt they were cheated by Britain and France and the United States after World War I because Japan, even though they're on the winning side, did not gain much territory at the conclusion of the First World War. Japanese government also would fall under the control of radical nationalists and allies within the army. Because of this, Japan began to expand its empire by invading Manchuria in 1931 and in West Asia in 1937. They did this under the guise that they wanted to create an Asia just for Asiatics. But this is what they would say publicly, but this was not what was happening in reality. The rape of Nanking was an example of what was actually truly going to happen. Why then Japan expand? First, Japan was a superior nation and wanted to conquer weaker nearby nations. Japan also needed more land because the population was growing. It needed more natural resources to feed and support its growing military and to access more raw materials which could be sold onto the market as surplus for profit. The significance and result of the first event was the invasion started the Japanese economy. It strained it, but it did create a need for more iron, ore, and oil to fuel the war effort. Iron, ore, and oil are critical components needed for a wartime industry and wartime economy. These were items that Japan had not enough supply of naturally. In the second event, happened in the summer of 1941 when Japan, Imperial Japan, took over French Indochina, which is eventually Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. You can see where the second is marked on the map. The idea of Asia for Asiatics was Japanese invasion of China consumed considerable amounts of materials and resources in the constant fight in China. Because of this, Japan needed to expand further so they can gain more natural resources. And even though they claimed to free Asia for Asian people from the evils of European imperialism, the Japanese often undertook the same policies as was previously done by the former European powers that had been removed. They became the same person, a power, such as when the Japanese troops entered into the city of Saigon. The significance of the second event was Japan did this because they needed natural materials for their industrialized wartime economy. But because of that, it resulted in the Americans cutting off oil supply shipments towards Japan. Even though in America they felt by cutting off oil supply would make Japan less aggressive, it actually had the exact opposite effect. It made China even more aggressive to gain additional territory, as well as it would match into their overall propaganda message of us versus them, East versus West. In the third event, December 7th, 1941, Imperial Japan's forces attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This iconic photo shows the USS Shaw exploding. On the attack, over 2,400 Americans were killed, 1,200 more were injured, such as when the Arizona, the new battleship, sank, taking all hands with it. Japan's attack actually on Pearl Harbor was an original four-pronged attack, but only two of the four waves were needed to achieve all the primary and most of the secondary goals to be achieved within the span of 1 hour. The main fight over Pearl Harbor was done by the Air Force, as Japan knew the Americans had built up a substantial military defense against any sort of a naval encounter. Defenses that include nets and mines and various other hillside embankment types of defenses. So naval attack onto Pearl Harbor would not be successful. Air, however, would have been successful. From American president, this was referred to as a day that will live in infamy. This was Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech, and this was the car. It was Al Capone's car originally. But because limited by government regulation that prohibited spending only $750 a car, the former Al Capone car, ironically, was the only bulletproof car that could be found. And the American government had this only because Al Capone, which actually is a really interesting history if you want to go to biography-wise, was taken because of a so-called tax evasion. From the attack on Pearl Harbor, there will be changes to the home front. During the war, countries had ration supplies to ensure armies were properly supplied. There was increased industrial production with conscription to create thousands of jobs, especially for the women. It is the wartime rationing. You see on this political cartoon the results of the wartime rationing. But also from Pearl Harbor, there was a fear of people from Japan. There was mandatory nighttime blackouts that were instituted in Hawaii and California. This was done to deceive Japanese pilots that they ever attempted to attack the United States from the mainland, while the ongoing fear of Japanese people and unfortunate racist prejudice tones continued to grow. This fear also resulted in the internment of thousands of American citizens that had Japanese ancestry. This was done in fearful of Japanese spies on the United States forces by the thousands of Japanese American citizens. Even Dr. Seuss, the famous cartoonist, fell victim to this fear and the not so subtle propaganda that you can see here in this simple cartoon. The notice for the Japanese internment camps and what was being done. On this map, it shows the locations of the American internment camps for the Japanese. Like what happened in Canada, a lot of these camps were located on the western side, but there was unlike Canada though, the Americans did have different types or camps that were run by different organizations, from armies to relocation, assembly, and other type of facilities, including an exclusion zone. However, were the Japanese Americans actually traitors? Most decorated units in U.S. history, the 442nd Regiment, were actually mainly consisted of Japanese American volunteers. This particular unit won over 4,000 medals, and it never had a case of desertion. In fact, the actual largest Japanese spy ring discovered outside Japan was not in America or Canada or Australia. It actually was in Mexico, the place that did not have any internment camps. Now, the significance of Pearl Harbor would be this. The Japanese would manage to catch the U.S. forces completely by surprise. The Japanese were successful in severely weakening the U.S. mighty Pacific Fleet, but it weakened the fleet. It did not destroy it, because the aircraft carriers, arguably the most important platform in the Navy, even today, the carriers were not in the harbor. And the significance of Pearl Harbor would be the United States would enter into the Second World War. After that, we come to event number 4, the spring of 1942, when Japan took over Thailand, Burma, Malaya, Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, a substantial land grab. From the land grab position in the Philippines, there was the unfortunate Bataan Death March, which resulted after Imperial Japan had took the Philippines, and the Army force marched 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers over 60 miles to a POW camp. This known march had 70,000 to 75,000 prisoners. Only 54,000 survived the horrific death march to the jungles. The fourth event would be the height of the imperial powers' mounted territory, as you can see in the map. You may want to pause this to further explore this for the upcoming map we're going to do in the course. Event number 5 was when the Americans had their first strike back against Imperial Japan, which was not relevant in military case, but was very significant in morale boosting, and that was the Doolittle raids on Tokyo. The plan for the Doolittle raid would be planes would bomb Tokyo and then land in China and in Russia. The significance is that the military was insignificant but psychologically important, because it showed the U.S. was capable of striking the Japanese mainland there, but China paid a heavy price for dropping and helping the American pilots to bail out over China after dropping their bombs in Tokyo. Now, the significance and advantage for the Americans at the Battle of Midway was, by the middle of 1942, the U.S. had already cracked the codes that were used for the Japanese transmissions, and this allowed the Americans to essentially set a trap for the fleet. The Midway was a disaster for Japan, as it surprised the Japanese fleet. Japan also lost 4 of its 6 heavy carriers, more than any other types of ships, and losing a carrier was a significant and irreparable damage to the fleet, as a carrier was the most important ship in any fleet during this time. The significance of Midway was it was a turning point in the war in the Pacific. Japan would now be on the retreat. The 7th event was the Battle of Guadalcanal. This marks the beginning of the Allied offensive and the overall strategy of island hopping. The idea of island hopping came from Douglas MacArthur, who was a general in the South Pacific. And rather than to invade every single island in the Pacific, which would be considerable, the Americans would hop from one island to another, but only target islands that would have the most strategic advantage and significance, while leaving other islands untouched or unoccupied. MacArthur was a soldier from the First World War and a general of the Pacific in the Second World War. When Japan invaded the Philippines, MacArthur vowed that he shall return. Upon waiting on the shore of retaking the Philippines, he stated to people, "I have returned." He was a very charismatic leader and something that the Americans would use as part of their overall wartime propaganda message in the Pacific. One thing in particular, of course, is the iconic image of him with the pipe in his mouth. At the Guadalcanal, the soldiers experienced brutal conditions fighting through dense jungles on the island. The fighting was intense and ferocious. Even while a private person said hell was red furious spiders as big as your fist, enormous rats and bats everywhere, and rivers with waiting crocodiles. Hell was a sour, foul smell of squishy jungle, humidity that rotted the body within hours. Hell was the enemy, so fantastic that it was used its own dead as booby traps. But with that, the Navajo code takers were Americans who were able to break the Japanese code. Americans who could use the Navajo code, the actual people, Navajo from Arizona, to break the code without Japan knowing that America had broken their coding. And in fact, Japan never knew this knowledge, and this provided the United States a substantial tactical advantage over the Imperial Japan's forces. The seventh event, or the significant, was for the island hopping. At Guadalcanal, they'll take the island after 6 months of hellish fighting. But the Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the American strategy of island hopping in the Pacific Theater. The eighth event was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Leyte Gulf was an act of desperation. Still under retreat after Guadalcanal, Japan made a gamble with the hope that his navy could turn back the war in their favor again by maintaining strategically important locations in the Philippines. The significance of this, though, was the gamble for Japan of what was left of his navy to defeat U.S., but Japan was unsuccessful, and the Japanese navy could no longer fight back. And the Allies, the Americans especially, were able to take the Philippines back. But truly, from the Leyte Gulf, the true significance of this battle would be Japan employing the strategy of kamikaze planes and its ground forces. The Battle of Iwo Jima, while the island was small, was very significant geographically. As the U.S. neared the Japanese mainland, the Japanese would use kamakaze, which means divine wind, to weaken the resolve and to break the American will to fight. The significance of it would be the Americans would take the small island after ferocious fighting, but truly, this small island made it so U.S. bombers could now reach the traditional homeland of Japan. It was within the range of the bomber planes. From that, lead to the 10th event, which would be the start of the firebombing raids on Tokyo. Tokyo would burn and would be ultimately utterly destroyed, as this photograph would show. The significance would be worse than any death toll of any other event of World War II after bombing started. One night of firebombing killed over 100,000 people in Japan, especially in Tokyo. And the death toll would continue to take on horrendous numbers. The Battle of Okinawa, event number 11, would be showcase of American soldiers landing on the shores of Okinawa. The U.S. defeated Japan Okinawa. Japan would lose over 100,000 people. The United States, 45,000 people. Okinawa was the only step left for U.S. before the suspected invasion of the homeland. The death toll for such a small island was truly horrendous. But then something happened. A light in the desert. The 12th event would be the start of the atomic bomb. The first atomic bomb exploding in the New Mexico desert. After receiving a letter from Albert Einstein on Germany's attempt to build an atomic bomb, Roosevelt started the Manhattan Project, the project of massive, incredible industrial scale to produce an atomic bomb. No other nation could really employ such considerable resources and manpower for a project and also keep it a secret, but America could. At the height, over 130,000 people would be employed in the project. Even Oppenheimer, after the first bomb, Trinity, was detonated, said, "I become death, the destroyer of worlds." So what was the U.S. considering before using an atomic bomb? They explored a few different options. One, a bat bomb was designed to carry bats wearing incinerated equipment in order to start fires in Japanese cities. But it was never used, and the bomb was detonated before the bat bomb would be finish its testing and be ready for deployment. Japan also has some unique ideas at home. Japan explored the idea of using a trans-Pacific high-altitude balloon. Japan launched 9,000 of these balloons, and some of these balloons actually reached continental United States, some as far east as Michigan. But this 12th event's significance is that it showed the atomic bomb worked. And the American President Truman authorized the use of it against Imperial Japan. Truman, following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, succeeded in the presidency on the 12th of April, 1945. And Truman and his cabinet determined dropping the bomb would be the quickest and, ironically, the most humane way to end the war in the Pacific, as war in Europe against Nazi Germany was over. So the 13th event, by mistake, would be the atomic bomb dropping on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The plane called the Enola Gay took off from the island of Iwo Jima, and this plane changed the world forever. The mushroom cloud rising up in the aftermath of the first atomic weapon used on civilian population in the time of war. But what made it even worse was the radiation that caused severe suffering to people for decades after its use. The significance of the bomb, the first bomb being used, was that 80,000 people were killed instantly. Thousands more will die later on from the effects of radiation poisoning. But after the first bomb, Japan refused to surrender. So the 14th event, another bomb, the Fat Man, instead of the little boy, the Fat Man was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. 3 days later, Kokoro was the initial target, but clouds create poor visibility, so the pilots dropped it on Nagasaki. This was the last atomic bomb the Americans had at that time, but no one, especially Japan, knew that. All they could have known was that America might have had 20 more of these devices. The significance of the second bomb would be 70,000 more would die instantly. Thousands more will die later on from the effects of the radiation. So, because the atomic bomb's dropping, and then the Soviets breaking their treaty with Japan, and the Soviets beginning to attack Manchuria, the Japanese surrendered to General MacArthur on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. VJ Day, as World War II has two end dates, VE Day and VG Day, marks the end of the war. The surrender, with the fear of another atomic attack, Japan surrendered to General MacArthur on USS Missouri. despite the desire of some military officials and officers to continue fighting. The significance of this would be the end of the Second World War. Even though they signed a surrender treaty, and Japan would become unoccupied territory, as MacArthur would oversee Japan be transitioned into a constitutional monarchy, a democracy, an actual peace treaty will not be signed until 1951. The terms or conditions of the surrender will be as follows. Emperor Hirohito had to declare to the Japanese people that he was no longer divine, he was no longer a demigod here. He had to renounce his godhood. Japan was forced to demilitarize. They can only go to war if they were attacked, and their armed forces, even today, are for self-defense only. The United States would draw up a new constitution, a constitutional monarchy for Japan. Land and labor would change. Land would be redistributed in Japan. Unions would be formed and organized in Japan, and all citizens can vote once they reach the age of 20. And even though the war ended over 50 years ago, Japan and Russia never formally ended their hostilities. There's never been an official peace treaty between those two. The last formal attempt failed back in the year 2000 because Japan won 4 islands back from Russia. Russia refused. Or in 1974, Japanese soldiers, Hiro Onoda, came out of the jungle on the Pacific island of Lubang and gave himself up. He'd been hiding there for 21 years, unaware that Japan had suffered and had been defeated by the United States. This war in the Pacific was different from the war in Europe. It also marked an unfortunate turn where neither side viewed the other as human. But it is still important that we know and understand what happened.